So our last panel discussion, which will then lead to our final activity of the day, is going to be focused on innovations to house the homeless. We've used the word innovation quite a few times today, and I think it's actually useful as we return to the room to think about what are the spaces of innovation, and in particular, social innovation. So you've seen in our conversation today that some of the innovations that are happening both in government, the private sector, philanthropic sector, are focused on social finance issues. Sometimes bringing finance to excluded communities, sometimes creating new financial vehicles to deliver social impact. You've seen some of the social innovation that we're talking about embedded in new enterprise models. As Tony mentioned, he views himself as a social entrepreneur. My colleague in the business school who runs the social entrepreneurship program says housing is the original social enterprise. And it is, because you're delivering not only shelter, but you're delivering all sets of access points that we talked about earlier today. I think it's useful, and especially in this conversation as we focus a little bit more explicitly on housing the most vulnerable, to think about those other spaces of social innovation. One of those spaces is around social movements. And we're going to talk a little bit about a social movement that's happening here in LA County that most of you are aware of. And it even has a title, the Everyone's In campaign. And we'll talk about that. Chris Coe of the United Way is certainly a point person on that. And we're also going to talk a little bit about innovations in developing new models of governance and engagement. And I think you heard some of that happening, right? So the way that we make public choices, or the way that we actually look to achieve the outcomes we hope to achieve, is probably going to have to be different than we had before. And so what I'd like to do just briefly is to talk about the Everyone's In campaign from the research side. And then I'll kind of introduce the panel. So we know that housing the homeless is a critically important topic. Ben Winter from the mayors mentioned that it is on the top of the agenda for all big city mayors. Housing the homeless, housing just in general, and that's why we're here today. So our friends and colleagues at the United Way, as I mentioned, Chris Coe is here today, has launched the Everyone's In campaign. And I think that is itself, it is a social movement, and thinking about what we need to do collectively to end the crisis that is 58,000 people who are unsheltered in the county. Part of that work, and part of the work that we're involved in here, is to take the collective talent and energy from a group of researchers to bring not only the best practices and evidence base to the policymakers, but also to think about what we don't know to kind of close the gaps that we face in terms of housing the homeless. And so what we have done with the help of many partners, including the United Way, including the Hilton Foundation, including colleagues from UCLA, from RAND Corporation, from the Economic Roundtable, from Apt Associates, and the list goes on to people in our Cal State system and other places, is to launch what is called the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. And the goal is to bring these local and national researchers together to design and coordinate timely, relevant, and actionable research to end homelessness in LA County. I don't know of too many other collaboratives that have focused on a particular issue in a particular place that have brought together such a rich set of the research community to engage directly with both the funding community and the policymakers in a timely manner. There's 4 objectives. And this list may grow as kind of the ask, in a sense, from the community grow. But we want to foster collaboration among researchers focused on homelessness. We want to conduct rapid response research and data analysis so that when policymakers give us a call, we can actually provide an answer within days and weeks, rather than, if you give me a few $100,000, in 5 years, I'll have an answer for you, right? We don't have that kind of time. We want to share current and upcoming research with policymakers and community partners to inform the on-the-ground work. And we want to provide a conduit to, when I mean RFP services, those are kind of requests for proposal services, like that when a funder has some funds that they want to solve a particular problem, oftentimes they don't know how to ask the question in a way that researchers understand it fully. And so that the Institute provides that conduit between the funding community, whether it's the county, the city, or a foundation, and the researchers who are the experts in particular spaces. And we can talk more about the Institute at a later time, but what I really want to do is to introduce this panel. We have 4 terrific experts with us today. When we're thinking about where we need to innovate to house the homeless, it's critically important to think about at least these 2 issues that I'm going to have on the next 2 slides, but there's many others because it really comes from a broader system. We need to understand what drives inflows into homelessness. There's data out there that tell us something about how many people fit into different circumstances that they might have listed as a primary or at least one of the key drivers of why they are living on the streets. You see issues around health, you see issues around substance abuse and mental illness, but even some of these numbers, given perceptions in the broader community, might seem low. You know, when I tell folks that 30% of people who are living on the streets have a mental illness, the most common reaction actually is they think it's much higher, right? And so what that means, then there's a whole bunch of folks that are living on the streets for other reasons. And when you look at these reasons, what's becoming an incredibly large region has to do with issues of housing instability and financial instability and unemployment. If you look at the most recent data from the 2017 demographic survey that LAHSA coordinates, over half the folks say that they're living on the streets. Either the primary reason or at least one of the top reasons is because of a loss of job, financial instability in that category. So if it's economics driving this, and we're trying to think about how do you solve the problem of having 58,000 people living on the streets, it's not just a issue of let's figure out how to, to house the homeless, but we actually have to think about the broader systems. And that's why a conversation today about the whole system of housing, as Tony said, building hundreds of thousands of units, not a few hundred here, a few hundred there, is the only way to have transformative impact in our city, in our county, and the region beyond. Because this is not a single city problem, it's not a single county problem, it's really a regional problem. There's a lot of really interesting innovations, and some of those we'll probably talk about today, that have enabled increase in exits from homelessness. Housing first models have developed an evidence base that suggests efficacy, that the dollars that go into these models save at least as much money as that are spent in terms of reduced healthcare costs and other costs. So when you look at, kind of solutions that on net gain, right, and in addition to restoring basic human rights and dignity, we should put our resources here and figure out how to do as much of this as we can. Thinking about how you can, kind of develop new case management models and improvements in ways that we actually meet the needs of those who are on the streets and meet them where they are is critically important. And there's a lot of research there, but if we're going to ramp up to face the need in our community of the 58,000 people who are living on the streets, then there's going to be a lot more training needed, a lot more kind of coordination needed to meet that need. For those of you who are in tables 1 through 5, your persona was Adam, who was someone living on the street. And so for at least 2/3 of you, you actually got an opportunity to interact with that persona and to figure out, what were the things that were barriers there? And you saw that some of those barriers had to do with a fear of the outreach worker, him or herself. And so one has to start thinking about, why is that there? And that's certainly indicative of a particular persona that we have to kind of think about when we're trying to solve this problem. So I'd like to invite the panelists to my left, and I'll join them in a conversation, a facilitated conversation, and there will be opportunity for questions from the audience as well. So you can come all together. Yes, please come all together. Well, whoever's closest to me, I'll just introduce in there, but it's not the order that they'll necessarily speak. So closest to me, to my left, is Andrea Iloulian, who manages the Conrad in Hilton's Foundation's domestic grant making in the area of chronic homelessness. Andrea is a proud Price School alumnus as well, and was instrumental in developing the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. To her left is Dora Gallo, who's the Chief Executive Officer of a Community of Friends, where she's responsible for leading the organization's efforts in project development, asset management, residential services, and advocacy and fundraising. To her left is Senator Kevin Murray, who's currently the president and CEO of the Weingart Center Association, which is a homeless social services agency serving Los Angeles. Senator Murray has served in this role since 2011. And to his left, we have Chris Coe, who's currently the Director of Homeless Initiatives for the United Way of Greater Los Angeles. In his role, he manages Home for Good, which is LA's collective plan to end homelessness. Chris and Home for Good, United Way, is also a key partner in the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. So I'm going to just move over here to the stools and just ask the panelists to think about what you would put as kind of the top priority in your work in either policy or in practice. What kinds of innovations do you feel like are still needed to get to the goal of ending homelessness in LA County? And we can maybe begin with Chris, and, or you want to go first? Yeah. All right, Andrea, you go first.
We re-coordinated ourselves.
Right,
thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. I've really enjoyed the day so far, and I feel like I'm learning a lot. Even though I manage the foundation's work in homelessness, and in a little while I'll talk a little bit about our PRI lending, which I think might be interesting given everything Allison shared earlier. I don't have a history in development. Actually, the only history I have in real estate are the couple years I spent managing a high-rise commercial office building. So be nice to your property managers. But I do want to share just this. I want to start with a basic concept. We know how to end homelessness. And if you're really into policy and you like to nerd out on it like I do, there is nothing more fun than working on a problem that has a solution. Because then our responsibility is really how to figure out how to get the resources, how to increase efficiency and effectiveness of the use of those resources. And I think that's really important, because when we talk about innovations around housing for individuals experiencing homelessness, we're not necessarily talking about redefining what the solution is. We're talking about little pieces of the system, pieces of the process that still could use some innovation around expediting development, or innovations around long-term housing retention. That's something that a lot of our partners are still trying to crack the nut on. So it's not that we're starting from scratch and we're trying to find the solution, we're trying to find the cure. We know that the solution to homelessness is housing. And the Conrad and Hilton Foundation actually focuses on chronic homelessness, and we have for almost 30 years. And we were one of the first funders in the nation to actually, Steve Hilton, the chairman of our board, had my job 30 years ago, and he got on a plane, he flew to New York, and there were some really creative people there who were creating the solution to chronic homelessness, which is permanent supportive housing. And here we are 30 years later, and actually our county Department of Health Services has a division called Housing for Health, and you heard a little bit earlier about the flexible housing subsidy pool. But that program actually implements permanent supportive housing to the full fidelity of the model. And when that happens, we have now seen they have a 96% housing retention rate. And they are housing some of the people that Gary was talking about earlier, the individuals that a lot of our neighbors consider, as the majority of the homeless population, although they're not. But those individuals with, repeat incarceration, severe mental illness, chronic health conditions, physical health, disabilities, those individuals, they are housing those hardest to serve individuals, and those individuals are staying housed and thriving in their housing. And so I'm happy to speak a little. I know we'll dive a little bit deeper into the innovation, but I just think on this question generally, I think it's really important to focus on the fact that there are pieces of the solution that can be sped up made more efficient, that can be taken to scale. It's not that we have to find the solution. That's not where the innovation, I think, in this space is totally needed.
So who did want to go next?
Well, I mean, I can say I completely agree.
Right,
and
yeah.
so it's very refreshing to hear the fact that there is an agreement that we do know how to end homelessness. And basically it's giving someone a home. But what goes into that? Because I noticed that this workshop, the panel is called House the Homeless. Yes, that's one aspect of what we're trying to do, but what we're trying to do is end homelessness. Giving someone a home, in many cases, is insufficient. They need to have the individualized services and all the other things that they need to be stable in housing. And I do agree that it's tweaks to the existing systems where the innovation can occur, not only to the processes, but also to the regulations that are put upon us as we develop affordable housing. My organization is one that has been doing permanent supportive housing before there was a name, permanent supportive housing. And it just so happens that we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year too. So just like Steve Hilton been in New York 30 years ago, this was happening right here in Los Angeles, very quietly. We were one of the first organizations in the country to realize very early on that for those who have a mental illness particularly, it is much harder to get them stable in housing. And at the time, in Los Angeles, all we had was shelters and transitional housing. So we, interestingly, were actually formed with a grant from the LA County Department of Health. They gave an individual within the Los Angeles community, a woman named Tanya Toll. Many of you may know of her because of her propensity to start nonprofit organizations in LA County. She actually started an organization. She gave us this very unusual name, a community of friends. When I joined the organization, I asked her, where that name came from, because a lot of people thought we were Quakers. and I had to explain myself in every community I went into. And she said that for those people with disabling conditions who've been homeless, she was trying to create a community where people felt like they're among friends. This is the most disenfranchised homeless population in anywhere because of the difficulty in managing the mental illness. And we have now, over the span of 30 years, we actually manage and operate 43 apartment buildings. We're finishing another one this summer. We have several more in the pipeline. So we know the solution works for the thousands of people who've come through our buildings. And I would say the one other barrier that I'm starting to notice, particularly when we have so many people interested in helping solve the issue and wanting to fund it, is there is a barrier related to the ability to try. And it directly ties into the innovation piece. I don't think we're always that willing and accepting of failure. And the only way to innovate is to give someone really free rein, to test and to fail. And when you're securing funding to pilot something, sometimes so early on in the process, people are asking, what's the evidence? How do you know it's going to work? What makes you think it's going to work? It's part of the process. And I think that needs to be stepped back a little bit. If you really want to try new things, you've got to be able to be accepting of a failure.
Sure. Kevin, do you want to share some of your work?
So I'm a bit of a contrarian. I don't think we innovate at all, and I don't even think that we're talking about innovation. For the most part, what we've done is ask for more money to do the same things that we've always done with less bureaucratic barriers. We want less barriers to building housing, we want less NIMBYism, and we want more money to do it. I don't think we really innovate. I think we really follow an orthodoxy. And we follow an orthodoxy where we pick one thing and we say, let's all do that. You just saw on the board there, housing first. Not a general problem with housing first, but now we're doing housing first almost to the exclusion of everything else, with the exception of some interim housing, which is supposed to set you up for, which is essentially warehousing until you get to permanent supportive housing. So that's taken all the funding away from transitional housing. They're literally, LAHSA has no transitional housing program at all, neither does HUD. So I think this idea that we all go, to use this USC term, student body right, and everyone goes to housing first, I think doesn't work. I think there's also this concept which the professor mentioned of dealing with prioritizing higher acuity folks. So what has happened is we prioritize higher acuity folks largely because, as you pointed out, It reduces cost in the hospital system, and by the way, the whole thing was designed for the purpose of reducing costs at the county hospital as opposed to actually solving homelessness, at least in my view. And by focusing all of our resources on the higher acuity folks, we have completely abandoned lower acuity folks who, with less input, can have a higher chance of long-term success. Because many of those higher acuity people, they're going to be on some kind of public assistance for the rest of their lives because they have severe issues and they deserve our help. But there are people who we could help, who could get back to participating in society, and we completely ignore them for a long enough time that by definition, then they become higher acuity people. So we've completely ignored them. And again, nothing wrong with prioritizing and helping people who are the most vulnerable, but going all student body right and doing all that to the exclusion of everything else, I think has harmed us. And so we tend to follow on this orthodoxy. You know, we're sort of dipping our toe into the development of permanent supportive housing. We happen to propose a big project. But so Proposition HHH passed. Voters gave us a bunch of money. You get roughly $120,000 a unit is at the subsidy, but there's a cap of it on 12 million, at 12 million. So the incentive is just to keep doing things that are about 100 units each. And so I don't know if you, but I don't think you get to 10,000 units at 175 or 100 or 125 a pop. And then the last thing I think that we need to be concerned about is all of the new income that's come into the system was given to us by voters, by the public. We don't pay attention at all to the needs of the public. So Mrs. Jones voted for this money in the anticipation that the homeless encampment near her might at some point be cleaned up. At the moment, because we are locked into this acuity model in CES and someone gets on there and there's some secret algorithm that determines their acuity, we can't, nobody in the mayor's office or in a councilman's office can say to Mrs. Jones, we're gonna do that, because you go out there and you sign them up and you put them on a list. So there's no ability for us to address the needs of the public and their reasons for giving us their public money. And as a result, as you saw in Orange County, as you've seen in most recent press articles, the tide is turning on us. And so I think we have to get back to some place where we are not only making progress, but not innovating just within ourselves, but advocating also for the needs of our public, of the public, because we have no ability to think about geography when it comes to parsing out these numbers. It is only based upon the acuity of the client. So hopefully I didn't put a whole damper on the
No, I appreciate it.
on the concept.
Throughout the whole day, the point is I've been trying to make, you can't have innovation without uncomfortability and disruption. And disruption to orthodoxy is critical for the conversation. Chris, you could maybe start us off by what I call the creation of a social movement, which if we do know exactly what we should do, which is up to some debate about the next dollar, where you spend the next dollar, right? That can be debated. But how do you get everyone in, and what has to happen to change the system in terms of governance and engagement to do what we need to do? And what is United Way's vision to accomplish that?
Yeah, thank you. So much to talk about. Panel wouldn't be fun without a little back and forth. So I have all these points to respond to Senator Murray, and then your first question, and now this one. So I'm not sure which to pick from.
Do Kevin first.
Huh? Yeah, should we do Kevin
Come after me first.
And we were just talking about doing lunch, so we'll also talk about this together. But 30 years ago, I was celebrating my birth, so I think I'm a little bit older than that, but
That's part of the problem.
so you know, innovation and all those things. But Asians, we look a lot younger than we actually are. So not
touching that one.
There. So I think one thing in response to Senator Murray's points and questions on interim housing. I mean, housing first includes shelter. I think we should be clear about that. It's a philosophy that is in itself a fairly new innovation, like Gary's pointed out, that has not been the orthodoxy for much longer than the time we've been working on this. In that, I mean, just a few things in terms of transitional housing. We actually still have thousands of units of transitional housing. And especially for transition age youth, we find that it is an important standard, and we maintain and keep funding that. And even on HUD, we do have thousands of units of transitional housing right now as we speak in the city that we can look into. Also, because of this work, the issue with shelter previously had been, where does that go, right? If it is an interim source on the way to something, the point of what we've innovated is we want to create the back end to that, so it doesn't just become a waiting room or a purgatory where there's no exit. And so part of having the housing on the other side has meant that we can more confidently fund shelter in ways we didn't, which even in the city's budget, we have more funding for shelter today out of the general fund than we have 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's probably the most funding we've ever had from the general fund for shelter in the city of Los Angeles. So those are just important facts, I think, to ground us in. And even on the part of regionalization and with the coordinated entry system, part of what we aimed to do was regionalize the solution, because we used to have these really county-wide efforts. And so LA is a big place, so making sure we had systems in each region that were housing each people. And we're actually working right now at this moment on a project that helps a project that's opening really draw from local areas to bring people inside. So those are a few points to Senator Murray's question earlier. Now to get to Gary's question and some of what he asked, a lot of what we focus on is in the innovation. I think as much as the next innovation, what we focus on is creating the right environment for innovation to continue to happen, which in our opinion, one starts with good and key and real data. I think another side is having the policy-making support in the background to take an innovation and actually put it into practice. Having flexible money that Dora talked about to match along with public dollars that are usually more risk-averse to make sure that there's a first entry into the work. And then having the public support, right, to scale that and move that. And that's, Gary, what you were talking about. And I think for the public, a lot of what our public friends want to know is what's possible and what's going to happen and when, right? And I think that's key to the public support being part of this. When we talked to the public as part of the Everyone In campaign, they said, we want to know the plan. And when they said plan, they did not mean a 200-page document. They meant we want a number and we want milestones along the way to that number. And we even asked them, I even asked them outright in the focus group, I asked them to add a question of, if you did not see visible progress on the street for more than a year, what would keep you engaged? What would keep you reassured? And they said, if I knew what was going to happen in that year and how long it would take to actually see that change happen over time. And I think those are some of the things, I think historically, we've been nervous about setting goals and being clear on what those are, but those things and being realistic with how and when things are going to happen, I think is critical to keeping the public engaged.
So I kind of alluded to it, and this has been part of the conversation today. Sometimes there can be the challenge to fight over, to use an econ term, a marginal dollar, the next dollar. Right? Is the next dollar going to go to market housing? Is it going to go to permanent supportive housing? Is it going to go to temporary, transitional, those kinds of things? How do we think about that question differently than maybe how we have in the past? Because maybe the innovation is not in a new program, but it's instead how we think about deploying resources. And anyone can kind of take the view from either your side of providing services and housing to kind of being a funder or...
I think that's exactly right. Where you spend the next money is maybe the definition of your innovation. But I think the way we talk about it now, it's still an orthodoxy. So you can argue whether you should spend it to subsidize permanent supportive housing or affordable housing or interim housing or crisis housing. But those aren't innovations. Those are things that we already do that will say, let's spend some more money there. And I think nobody, to my knowledge, has ever sort of thought about, let's break it down to the very beginning. So is our CES system the right way to do it? Is high acuity prioritizing the right way to do it? And my suspicion is the answer is that in some cases it is, and some cases it's not. Where do we draw those lines? There's a million ways that people got to homelessness. I think we delude ourselves in thinking there are 4 solutions to solving it. And even when you listed sort of the reasons people got to homelessness, the one thing I didn't see up there was family structure. You know, there's not much talk about family reunification. Again, I'm older than you, but when I was growing up, I'm aging myself, but post-Vietnam era, there was always every family had that uncle or cousin who just never got his stuff together, who lived in grandma's basement. That guy is no longer living in grandma's basement. That guy is living on a tent, in a tent on 6th and San Pedro. So why, aside from incarceration and the 80s drug wars and all the other things we talk about, you know, why is that person? And the other thing that we found, there's a woman who camps out in front of our building, is that we have this also very middle class social worker sort of assumption that if you provide an apartment, somebody who's homeless will go there. And I don't think that that's an assumption. I think all of you read probably Steve Lopez's series on Nathaniel Ayers, where he had Steve Lopez as an advocate, and he still didn't want to live in this apartment. And you know, also the idea that, all right, I live on, you know, Maple and 6th Street, and here's an apartment in Tahunga, where you got no family connection, no personal connections, no other sort of community that we expect you to live in that apartment, because we really can't fathom the idea that you would choose to live on the streets as opposed to the apartment. So I just think we need to challenge all of those orthodoxies, to your point, and start from the bottom. And we'll probably find a mixture of things. Some of these things will work perfect for some clients, and some won't.
So yeah, so there's a couple of things. First, I would like to invite you, Senator Murray, to the CES Policy Council meetings, which are public meetings that are being held by LASA, where we are actually, at the current moment, having this really difficult debate about how we prioritize resources and how the coordinated entry system is prioritizing people. And actually, Chris and I are both on the council, and the domestic violence community has done an immense effort of showing up and voicing their concerns for the way that the system works, and not only pointing out prioritization issues, but also just general systemic issues. And they are getting some of their needs ticked off just by being there and coming and voicing their opinion. And so we haven't actually, there hasn't been, I would welcome that sort of debate and discussion, but you see the council sit, and it's providers from the youth community and some, you know, veterans and the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Health Services, and we all have different priorities. And I think it just goes back to this idea that I'm gonna start in a different place. The coordinated entry system was not designed just to prioritize people who are high acuity. The coordinated entry system was designed to better match clients to their need. So if you were an individual and you walked into a shelter that only provided supportive housing, sometimes you were placed in supportive housing when really all you needed was a rapid rehousing voucher and access to really good workforce services to get back on your feet. And so the idea was to better match clients to the services they need, no matter where they presented themselves. You could present yourself at the Tahunga Wash, or you could present yourself in Skid Row, or you could be in South LA, and you got connected to the idea is to connect you to the services and the housing that works best for you. The problem is, even with all the money that we have, there is still not enough money. So this council is sitting around trying to have a conversation about who we prioritize, which is like an ethical question. And I'm not an ethicist, and it is a very difficult question to have. But I invite all of you to come and engage in that conversation, because It is a difficult one, and we want to hear the people on the council want to hear the voices of the community. The other point I want to make is an excellent point about the other systems, and actually it's something we've all kind of talked about. The idea that people who enter into homelessness don't just enter for one reason, it's multiple reasons. And actually the recent report by the Economic Roundtable, and Gary mentioned a similar point, really emphasized the idea that it is not just the responsibility of the homeless services community or PSH developers to end homelessness. It's the responsibility of the Workforce Investment Board, the DCFS, and the foster care system. It is not just the responsibility. And actually, there is an innovation that I'll just speak to really briefly, where the probation department for the County of Los Angeles is paying for rapid rehousing for homeless probationers that's paired with intensive workforce supports. And they're housing hundreds of homeless probationers using probation dollars and having really high success rates. And they didn't know what they were gonna get when they started, but they're actually reunifying families more than they ever thought they would. I think they weren't even 100% sure, what that was gonna look like, but they are reunifying families, and they're having a lot of success in this program. But it's a really good example, and kudos to the probation department for putting their own dollars on the table to kind of help solve homelessness and reduce recidivism. And if you talk to the staff that work at the probation department, they talk a lot about how it has made their job easier. They can be a probation officer because they don't have to be a housing navigator or go out looking for the client and hoping that they find them. They know where that individual is and living, and they can support them in a more productive way. So that's a really great example of an innovation where resources are coming from another source because there's been a recognition that this is sort of a shared responsibility. I have other stuff, but I want to let other people talk. I can get to my other stuff later, yeah.
So what I don't know if that's so much innovation as realization. So where I struggle and where I really would like to see innovation is in the language that we use to talk about what we're trying to accomplish. And maybe in some ways it's ground up, as the senator said, but I really struggle with the word prioritization. I cringe every time I hear it because it assumes, or it takes as reality that this is a zero-sum game. And if one group gets prioritized, another group doesn't, And when the whole emphasis came out, and it shifted over time, when we first talked about housing people who are chronically homeless, I really chafed at that because I had individuals, I had parents, single mothers, kids living in their cars, and I was told that I could not put them in my apartment building because they've only been homeless for 300 days, not over 365 days. And when I heard I had a building that was opening, and in the middle of the lease-up process, they changed the criteria on us. And even though we said, you should not do that, you should wait until the next project, it was like deaf ears. And I had service providers telling me that their clients were suicidal because they were on the list and then they were not taken off. It was very hard as a provider to hear that. And so how do we change that language? How do we help everybody? And I know that we don't have a lot of resources, but I think we need to change the way we think and the way we talk about it. That's where I think the innovation needs to occur, and that's where I think it's missing.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And no matter how we slice it, it does become a priority list. We would like to think it's not. We would like to think that we're connecting people in some way. But there's 10 houses. There's 12 people on the list. The people are prioritized in some way. And you almost have to do that in some way. But are there ways to slice and dice it to make it more rational and reasonable?
What about what we talk about in the affirmatively fair housing, which is balance, right?
Right.
Where's that balance? Can we find some way of balancing everyone's needs and then working within the various constituencies that need the housing? Why are we not using the word balanced?
I think on the broader, just to take a step back to Gary's question about how do we think about resources, we're talking within housing, but just to reemphasize where we started, I think it's important to think about which resource investment unlocks the use of other resources. Mm-hmm. I think that's a way for this to be less than a zero-sum game. Because when we're talking about homelessness, I think what I want to level set for us here, even in the room, because I think the train is rolling and we're talking about really in-depth things, but when we're talking about homelessness, it is different than talking about ending someone's poverty, right? I just want to be clear on the distinction between that. We are not pretending like we are in one fell swoop ending someone's difficult situation, which has so many factors going into that. But the question is, if we were able to end someone's houselessness, is it more possible that some of the other things could, some of the other resource investments can be amplified? I think that's some of the question that we're talking about.
I think you have to define also what a home is.
Sure.
Is it a roof over your head, or is it a roof plus community or family or something like that? The other thing I think we ought to do is stop. If our goal is to solve homelessness, stop making it a budget play. That the most effective way to solve homelessness is not necessarily the most effective way to reduce county hospital and first responder costs. The way to solve homelessness is not necessarily the best way to reduce incarceration costs. Those things come into play, and they are an indicator of your success, a reduction in recidivism. But too often this has been placed in the context of investing in homelessness over here because we save money somewhere else.
Kevin, I think that argument is often made because even though everyone feels that they want to end homelessness, you're talking about people who are incredibly conservative, fiscally conservative. And I have had conversations with people where if I tell them, well, this individual was able to get off the streets and into housing, and they decided after a year to become sober, and then they quit smoking, and then they got a job, and now their tenant-based voucher, they're paying their rent, and they're no longer using the voucher, and their life was turned around. They're like, yeah, that's great. But then I'm like, also, that client spent, had 4 incarcerations and was continually enrolled in the hospital, and they didn't have that, recidivism anymore. And oftentimes that's what sells on that end. And so you can't, I think it's, the reason we talk about it on both sides is, and I think that's also, for a policy geek, a kind of exciting thing. You have a solution that in many senses is ethical and cost effective.
But what about Dora, for instance, the person that Dora was thinking about that didn't have 4 incarcerations and didn't have all of those things, but just had been on the street for 360 days instead of 365 days, for less money, probably, you could help that person. We don't really talk about helping that person. We only talk about
it all the time.
My people do have those things too.
Sorry, Garrett. This is going.
Well, no, all I'm saying is not student body right. I'm saying we need to do all of those things, and when you have these discussions, we do talk, because it's a better story to talk about the person who we brought from the brink of death to now being a success. But I don't know, and I think it's a question that should be researched, and I don't know whether emphasizing everything there is the solution. It shouldn't be. When I was in the legislature, most of the time I spent in the transportation area. And the buzzword in transportation is multimodal. You need a light rail, you need buses, you need bike lanes, you need trains, you need all of those things. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, our conversation on homelessness is not as broad a multimodal discussion as I think it could be.
Yeah.
I want to marinate on this idea for a moment and just actually ask a specific question and then come back to this, especially with the audience jumping in, because it is identifying both a political conversation and also a personal conversation, the human conversation that is absolutely critical. The very concrete question that I wanted to return to, which is tied into some of our conversations earlier today, is this notion of housing as a platform. And Senator Murray mentioned something that, again, triggered us back to that thought about what is it? Is it just, what is housing? Is it for this population that has been very insecure in their housing over time? So is it just 400 square feet? Is it 800 square feet plus these 2 services? Does it need to be in a project that has 50 units or less, 100 units or less? Can you accomplish it in a sense of a 500 unit project? And you alluded to that as well. It's like, it seems like the funding is set so it shouldn't go above 105. So I'd love for both Dora and Kevin first to speak to this notion of what is the housing that we are speaking about and what do we expect of it to accomplish?
Dora has much more experience doing this, but my response is that it should be all of those things. And it's going to depend on the individual, on the program, and we should have multiple ways of doing this. Building them is a whole nother thing. So Dora knows much more about that than I, but my just thought is that we should be doing all of those things and not fit into any singular orthodoxy.
But I think I'm going to go back to the first part, which is, the second part, which is, it is, what was the first part? But housing is a platform. Housing, absolutely. Even for someone who's been on the streets for a very long time, with incarcerations, with health needs, if we are successful in doing our jobs and providing not only an affordable place for them to live, but also the services they need to get back on their feet again, what happens next, right? I have tenants in our buildings, we call them the original tenants. You know, there's always in every building original tenants who were there from the very beginning when we first moved in. And we have people leaving over time because they've been able to move back with their family members, or they actually were able to secure an apartment without services. But for those who stay, even though they're stable in housing, they're still struggling with their mental health. They're still struggling with other types of disabilities that they may have. But for them, what happens next? What is the next step? And we find that, I would say from the very beginning, the first year, the most important thing is getting someone stabilized, getting used to being in their apartments. When I first started a community of friends, within 3 months, we had a tenant who we found out pitched the pup tent inside his studio, because lying on the bed was just too disorienting because it was too big. And I always remember that, because what happened was he treated everything else like it was the street. So he didn't use the toilet. You know what happened to that building. So we learned to help him get stabilized. And then that's the first year. And then after that, it's connection to family. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. It's connection to health needs. What are the other needs that they need to attend to? Eventually, it's connection to family. By the time they usually end up in the buildings, they've burned all their bridges with their family for whatever reason, and friends as well. So it's a progression of stage, and after a certain point, if you have any social workers in the room, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you start with the basic, you need air, you need shelter, and then it's self-actualization. Even for our tenants, 18 years in a building, they're still striving for something more. What is that connection? And that's when usually we get them involved with speaking programs, advocacy programs, United Way stuff, home walk, right? Just to get them to engage and become productive. So it is something that comes after housing, but it's certainly a platform for something else. And I should mention we serve families too, right? So there's nothing, I always say, there's nothing wrong with the kids other than perhaps trauma that we're working with. But to see the kids in our building grow up, go on to college while their parents are still living parents are still living in our building, and to hear them say that their aspiration is to get a good job so they can take care of their mom or their dad. That's pretty amazing, and that's the next step to be able to instill in the young adults who move in that they can change their lives from they're living in a car, in a shelter, on the streets. And so it's always trying to provide those additional resources to get them to go to the next level, whatever that next level is for their definition.
I think in answering, a simple way to answer that question, I don't think we have to think that much harder than what your answer would be to the same question of what you consider housing.
Right.
I think it's a similar answer. I mean, but I do think that's a different, just to be very clear, I think there's two questions here to affirm Senator Murray's point, which is, can other forms of shelter be valuable and helpful? Yes. Is that a substitute for housing in its kind of full and permanent form? I think that's the other question I'm asking you to think about. And I think right now, the reason why some of the people, our friends, are outside, there's someone we were reaching out to, and we kept reaching out, talking about this housing, the kind of housing that Dora builds that was available. And he told us, oh, housing isn't for people like me. I know that, now I know. Then we're asking him, what do you mean? And he said, well, I've tried housing, and I just can't keep up with the rules. I've tried a few times, and now I know housing isn't for people like me anymore. What he meant was he had gone into programs that had rules for things, and after a few times, that in his mind was the only form of housing that was available to him. That is the reason why we want to have a full spectrum of housing available, Should they choose other options? Absolutely, they should be able to. But the kind of housing that you would say, like if you were in a congregate setting with lots of other adults, would you be grateful for that versus the street? I'm sure you would, but would you consider that this is the housing I've always strived for? I'm not sure. You know, so having at least the option of permanent housing, I think is critical. And I think the multimodal point, we would all agree to. I think the other thing about the this thing we're calling the coordinated entry system is basically a Match.com for housing. And the reason I bring that up is that the same way that there are a variety of human beings on Match.com, there are a variety of housing options on the coordinated entry system, one of which is non-supportive housing options like rapid rehousing. And it was actually after we had data in the coordinated entry system, for the first time we were able to actually advocate for what's called rapid rehousing, which is a new form of transitional housing, where we hope to say, hey, there's actually all these people who could make it with lower levels of time-limited support. So that actually led us to have the first investments in non-veteran rapid rehousing in LA for the first time. So all to say that those multimodal, I think that's absolutely part of the dialogue and something that we would all agree on. But permanent housing.
I think that's just not happening on the ground. I think Dora's example and what you just mentioned sort of emphasizes the need for transitional housing. And interim housing is not the same as transitional housing. So interim housing essentially puts you in a place and gives you some case management and feeds you and houses you, but it doesn't offer you the life skills training or the workforce development that used to be included in LAHSA's transitional housing model. So interim housing, rapid rehousing, all of those things don't come with the kind of intensive services that long-term transitional housing used to have. And they also don't have enough time frame. So the person, because what happens when you're on the street for some period of time is you lose
skills.
You lose what we used to call home training, you know, that you got from your parents about how to act. And the point you made about rules is absolutely correct. You know, someone once told me that, well, no one would choose to live on the streets. But the real answer is no one would choose to live on the streets depending on what their options are. So I don't go and live in grandma's basement because grandma's going to impose some kind of rules. Even if you have an apartment of your own, there are some rules. You have to be a good neighbor. And that lack of rules and the lack of life skills is what you lose after being on the street. And that is what transitional housing used to provide. And it is what interim housing and rapid rehousing do not provide. I run an AB 109 program. I run an ex-offender program, not I, but our organization. We also have Housing for Health. We also have the Housing for Health ODR program. We have all of those programs. None of those programs come with funding on their own for life skills or workforce development. They simply pay a bed rate and for a case manager.
But the case manager is providing the services, right?
They
should be doing the independent living
The
skills.
case manager is providing one-on-one services,
Right.
but life skills and workforce training and all of those things are much broader.
Yeah.
They're groups. They don't provide funding, for instance, anger management. Some significant portion of these people, folks that are on the street that come to us, need anger management because you've got to shift from a prison/street mentality to how do I manage a conflict with my neighbor versus the way I did it on the street. None of those programs, interim housing, rapid rehousing, come with funding for that kind of clinical service.
Kevin, are you, just a question. Are you saying that you're getting less money from Housing for Health or ODR for those clients than you were getting for transitional?
No, but you're talking about a 6 or 8 year difference in sort of costs went up. So Housing for Health, by the way, is a decent rate, and they, by the way, I want to thank them because they were some of the first to sort of come up with, ask us, what does it really cost?
Yeah.
What does it really cost to provide the service? But the service that you're getting for the rate that you're getting for most of those people does not include the kind of, first of all, they're all per diem rates as opposed to LAHSA's transitional rates used to be a cost reimbursement rate, and you had to submit a budget and you said what your program was going to be, and they reimburse those costs. So on a per diem basis, it's frankly a little bit different.
I think
and
it's
a little
all
bit
insider
apples to
ball game.
apples. Yes.
You guys are going,
My question was just, it was just a general question.
But there isn't,
Sorry.
you know, from HUD and from LASA, there isn't a long-term, more than 6-month transitional program that will include life skills or workforce development.
So the conversation so far has highlighted some really important issues around kind of what the goal and objective is, and I think actually there's broad agreement on what that is. When we have limited resources, which certainly all the new voter initiative dollars plus whatever Hilton and the other funders can bring to the table are insufficient without the broader systems being in place to catalyze the additional housing, additional services kind of being brought to bear in a coordinated way. You've had a chance to marinate over some of the political issues that we face. And so now I'm going to turn it back to the audience to ask the panel questions.
Meaning is made through storytelling, right? And we have a story that we tell about how we're going to end homelessness. It's part of a larger story of Los Angeles. And this is getting to your point about the public and how we serve the public's need. The public is telling a story and is hearing stories being told. And part of my question is, how do we respond to the public's need by shaping the stories that they tell in each community and about a larger story of Los Angeles? Because I think that's absolutely necessary. And the second half is, it's in the context of the other two panels that we've heard today, right? Because so what we haven't talked about yet is what does the homelessness crisis have to do with the housing crisis, have to do with workforce issues? And it feels like, so I'm just going to quote Phil Ansell, and then I'll let you guys respond to this ramble. A week ago at SC, there was the other summit, and Phil Ansell said, we are going to keep our promise with Measure Age. We are going to house 45,000 people. We're going to prevent 30,000 people from becoming homeless. And at the end of doing that, it's entirely possible there will be more homeless people than there are now, unless we also prevent other people from falling into homelessness. So how do we, A, make the public and the community understand that and respond to it appropriately, and B, prevent them from wanting to kill us all because of
Well, I want to speak quickly. I'm not going to answer sorry, Andy, I'm not going to answer either of your questions. But I am very quickly going to say that we have a terrible housing crisis, and it is very much the cause of our homelessness crisis, and the fact that we are housing more people every year, permanently housing more people every year than we ever have before, but the number keeps going up. So it's sort of like the mayor says, we're swimming upstream, but the stream is coming too fast the other way. I butchered whatever he said, but that's what he said. And Tony Salzar said in his panel that we need a campaign we need to organize Angelenos about the development of housing, and it spans a spectrum. It goes all the way from supportive housing, and I talk about supportive housing because that's what I do for my job, but I have friends who cannot afford to live in the neighborhoods they grew up in, to buy homes, who are moving to other cities when they want to be close to their families here in Los Angeles. The problem is immense, and I would love, it's not going to be the Hilton Foundation, but I would love for someone to launch that campaign, because I think the homeless services community and the coalition that helped pass H and Triple H would get behind that kind of campaign. So I want to throw that out there.
I've spent some time, as you can imagine, dealing with voters. So, so I think Chris and the United Way do as good a job as you could possibly do as selling in telling the story. And they told the story well enough to get people to vote for H and HHH. So they drove that, and they won, and they did it big. But here's the thing you got to think about. That, they've always said all politics is local, and all politics, it even goes further than that. It's really down to the block. So if you do all the things that Andrea mentioned, and if we house 45,000 people, and even if there are some other people out there, if the homeless encampment that is in the alley behind Mrs. Jones's house is not cleared out, Mrs. Jones will think we're a failure. And so we've got to figure out how to be able to prioritize sometimes geography as opposed to acuity in order to make the public understand a little better. And we've got to be able to spread that out. You know, I once proposed that some resources should be divided by council district so that they could address some geographic priorities, and I was strung up on a petard, much like I might be today.
But it's happening now.
But no, it isn't.
It is.
So
Yeah.
there's
There's two proposals out there.
So
that's been adopted, yes.
they're now talking about that a little bit. But the answer to your question is, we've got to not just talk to ourselves and talk to our clients, but we've got to talk to normal members of the public and say, not what they've done a lot of work in this regard, but you know, part of the problem is when you talk to voters, it's very much about their individual needs and what they see happening on their block and in their neighborhood. And that's a story we have to tell better.
Really quickly, I think one part of what this innovation relates to the broader dialogue broadening is that unless people understand that efficiencies and partnerships are being crafted really well within the homeless sector, people will question that as the reason for the lingering homelessness crisis. So I think the more people realize, and this was our own journey as a United Way, and when we started by partnering with the Chamber of Commerce, we thought if we just fix all of this stuff, that fixes homelessness. As you fix that stuff, you realize, oh, there's this thing still left. And I think even in the media narrative, when before there weren't collaborations happening, when there wasn't money being matched with other money, when those things haven't happened, people struggle to move on to the broader narrative. But to the extent that people appreciate and see the innovation within the sector, they can appreciate that the problem is broader than the homeless services community. So I think that is one way we can broaden the question. And even in the media portrayal of the homeless count, you were starting to see this last year for the first time, where they saw that the permanent placement number was 30% higher than before, and we've housed chronically homeless persons at a rate hundreds of percentage points. So knowing that we're housing more people than ever before, working together better than ever before, and still seeing it, I think even in the media, the conversation started shifting. You started seeing a shift to affordable housing, affordability of housing as a cause of homelessness.
And I just want to say one quick thing about the fact that, you know, we're very locally based, and I think that's, you know, all politics are local too. But to Andrea's point is that nationally, there's a number of different campaigns that are going on trying to highlight this as a national issue. Some of you may be aware, well, maybe you're not aware, but there's the Make Room campaign that's national. There's the Home Matters campaign that's also national. And then, I don't know if Alan's is still here, but the MacArthur Foundation just funded this effort called Opportunity Begins at Home, and that's national too. And because we understand that the affordability crisis is impacting homelessness, but that starts with affordability, and I think those three campaigns is something that you guys might want to look into. You can get involved individually or organizationally.
The coordinated entry system, we know that there are service providers that are boots on the ground, engaging with homeless every day, even outside of the normal business hours from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. And there are many that are not in the coordinated entry system. What is LASA or the force here? What are you doing about recruiting and certifying more service providers, the smaller ones, to be able to grab that money?
Yeah, it's a key point of innovation, which is that we need everyone in to get everyone in. But so we practically were doing this capacity building RFP. So Hilton put out a challenge grant of $1 million that we then went out to raise that matching amount and then tied in with some Measure H money for capacity building, broadly to bring in people who are not yet part of a LASA contracted world to work on. I mean, this is where like innovation also looks like having bookkeeping at your agency. It looks like having policies and procedures. It means having a governance and having a strong board and HR hiring practices. I mean, that practically is the kind of innovation that is moving the needle in what we need. So Rachel, to your question, there is this multi-million-dollar RFP out right now. So if you know organizations who are trying to get in the system, it is a grant opportunity we have as we speak. And then the whole point of the coordinated entry system was actually to break that paradigm, because before you had government contracts with specific agencies. And if you didn't have that contract, you were out of luck for that housing. So what the coordinated entry system does is it lets you plug in even without having those contracts. It lets you access. It's an open source system. It's kind of like your phone. If it's the operating system, if you want to make an app to plug into it, you can. But to your question, we need to support people to plug in, which is what this capacity building RFP does.
The other innovation I'll just quickly mention is there's a new, well, it's a couple years old. It's called the LASA Training Academy. Did I get it right? Something like that. And was actually seeded by philanthropy through the Home for Good Funders Collaborative a couple years ago to offer free trainings, because I don't know, many of you know, but the homeless services system needs to hire like thousands of people. And so when you bring thousands of people on, that's a huge burden on the providers to do a lot of the training. So what LAS is doing is offering free trainings to kind of help cover some of that burden. And the county this year actually gave almost $1 million to help fund those trainings on top of the philanthropic effort. So there's that as well. And as far as I know, I've been asking around, and if you know of another community that's doing that, I don't think there is any other and community where the COC offers this level of training for free to providers in the community. We also hope that what it'll do in terms of, I guess, innovation is help provide a higher level standard of care, because all of the providers are going through the same level of training to some degree.
The other thing that LASA did, frankly, which is as important as those other things, started paying faster. The real problem with small providers is they don't have the capital to float their expenses while they're waiting for their payment. So they've put a lot of time and effort and hired a bunch of people in the accounting department to make sure they pay their invoices fine. I mean, at one point, we were $1.5 million behind with LASA. So, and you know, we're a $15 million organization, so $1.5 million is still a lot of money for us to float. And so some small organization where their payroll is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months behind would be very difficult. So they have made great strides in their payment processing, which I think will help enable the smaller providers.
I just have a quick question. I think something that Kevin Murray touched on earlier is that, yes, we're allocating foundations, government is allocating a lot of money into the housing and homelessness issue, but I think in terms of innovation, how do you prevent it? One of the things that was discussed in an earlier panel was the workforce housing. Yes, they're developing affordable housing, but even when someone is in the working poor, someone that is working in a service industry, they can't even afford that. So again, I think in terms of how do you innovate and how do you create opportunities to address those issues in terms of preventing homelessness. And the other thing we hear is that students at LAUSD, the homeless population, they're double last year. So, you know, those are issues that also need to be addressed. One last point is that, yes, foundation and government, they're throwing a lot of money into homelessness and housing. But in a downturn economy, you know, how long is that money gonna last? So, you know, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
On the question of money, I think it's an important one that we should keep context in mind. This is probably the single biggest social issue of our time right now. $355 million, $5 billion over 10 years seems like a lot. That is less than the annual budget of LAUSD, right? So just in context to your question and point, it is more money than we've ever had, and still not a ton of money, you know, in an era where we're building $1 billion stadiums, right? So I think that is, I think, an important point. The other reason why this is so important, Measure H funds local prevention initiatives for the first time. HUD federal dollars actually do not let local areas work on prevention unless they have made a certain amount of progress on the issue at hand. So it's kind of like they don't let you go upstream and ignore the people drowning in the lake in front of you yet. And so that's also practically why it's important, which is that, and that's actually the first project of the Homeless Policy Research Institute, is to evaluate one of the first prevention programs that the 3rd District, Sheila Kuehl's office, is funding. So we will definitely be learning a ton about that in the next several years, so stay tuned for that.
We have time for just one more question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to tell you that I think that the work you're doing on homelessness is the most visionary and innovative work happening in the city. It's incredible. So it's really think very highly of the work that all of you are doing, and in particular, Hilton and United Way have been true leaders. And coordinated entry is truly innovative, and I think very important part of the work. You know, from my vantage point, the problem we're facing in the housing crisis, you know, Los Angeles is a mega city of the world, much like there's probably about 40 places in the world that have populations exceeding 10 million people. Most of the mega cities in the world, or mega regions, have a major housing problem. So whether you're looking at homelessness in Los Angeles, or you're looking at, you know, Mumbai or Delhi or other large mega cities, Mexico City, everybody's kind of grappling with the same thing on an international level. And what I would like to ask is, I see a disconnect between the housing supply conversation and the homelessness or the homelessness conversation. I think that there needs to be a much stronger connection between those two. And when your prior panel said that affordable housing is non-economic, I think it's actually the point that Andrea's making is, well, actually, it's highly economic, but we have to look at where the costs and the benefits are. And so, you know, how can we strengthen the economic conversation, the cost and benefit conversation for housing people?
And I'll give one talking point that you can go home with that you might have heard earlier already. But almost formulaically, almost automatically, for every $100 of average rent that goes up, homelessness goes up between 5 and 15%. You can almost chart it in every single place. In urban communities, in rural communities, it goes up even more. So that's just a quick point to affirm what Helmi was saying. For every $100 in our average rent price, homelessness will go up 5 to 15%. The reason why, if you think about your favorite tabloid or your friends or family, you probably know someone who has struggled with unemployment, substance use disorders, or mental health. The difference between people who become homeless as a result of that or not, right? If you think of your favorite celebrity in your tabloid who has had serious issues with that, the reason why they don't become homeless is they can afford their housing. Mm-hmm. So that's why there are contributing factors to homelessness, but the ability to afford that house you're in is fundamentally how you get into homelessness.
And even when many people, even when they're affording the house they're in, they're barely affording. You know, it used to be 30%, a third was kind of the thing. You spend a third on housing. If you're a USC student living downtown, you're paying more than 50% of your income if you're a USC graduate student, right? But I think the cost-benefit analysis, to your point, is a pretty good one. Some years ago, a couple years ago, we were struggling with how do we advocate for ourselves? What's the story we tell at the Weingart Center? And so we came up with this campaign that was, we were asking people for donations to help people. And we started to phrase it in terms of an investment. So don't make a donation, make an investment. Mm-hmm. And we could list all the ways that a investment in the Weingart Center saved, you know, the money in other places. And it's a little bit about what Andrea was talking about earlier, that we certainly can make that cost-benefit analysis argument, because being the cynic that I am, which maybe you guys have figured out by now, I don't think we can, and going a little bit to your point, I don't think we can rely on the altruism of the public. I think we have to show them that what we're doing has benefits to them.
That's the point.
But so
that's the point she was trying to make.
But as there always is a but, it is benefit to the public. It is not a budget play for the hospital system. So I think we have to make those decisions. I've been in all those rooms where you switch around budget things too. So yes, this is a benefit to the public. Yeah. And I think if we can marry those two concepts, then we're actually in agreement.
Kevin, next time that Mitch Katz is here in Los Angeles, I want you to sit down and talk to him because he will tell you that for every hospital bed that he opened up, there was someone else in it. So it really, for him, was as an emergency room doctor, it's an ethical question. And I guess it wasn't when he launched Housing for Health, it wasn't as much about saving money on one end, but it was like, if we're gonna pay for these people to be in hospital beds, we might as well pay for them to be in housing. So it was more of an ethical goal, but I think you guys would have a riveting conversation. I would like to very much be there. I just wanna make one ask. I would like to make an ask of the real estate community, because we cannot end homelessness without you. Just as we talked about before, it's about more than just supportive housing for individuals who need that level of care. It's about affordable housing. It's about the whole spectrum. And we will not end homelessness in LA County if only the homeless services and developer community is working on the issue. We need the real estate community to be working with us to come up with ways for cost savings. I didn't get to talk about it, but we're doing a lot of pre-development lending at the Hilton Foundation. There's a lot of things that are happening that cause innovation, and a lot of the best innovations are happening in the for-profit or the real estate world, and so we need you as our partners if we're gonna actually do this.
Well, please join me with that in thanking our panel. Thank you very much.